Hey everyone! So the phrase cruel and unusual punishment, or variations thereof, appears in the laws of the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, India, South Africa, France, Germany, and Japan, among others. So in this video, I wanted to dive into that phrase, what it means, and what the history of the phrase is. So let's dive right in. The phrase cruel and unusual punishment is applied as a limit on government authority. That is, governments are not allowed to create a punishment that is cruel and/or unusual. This can be done in the constitutional sense, or it can be done through traditional laws that limit the power of the executive. So where does this idea stem from? Well, the idea of limiting what punishments governments are allowed to implement can be seen in some of the earliest legal codes. The Code of Hammurabi had principles aimed at limiting excessive punishment, even if by today's standards the penalties were severe. And other ancient and medieval civilizations made references to proportionality in punishment. But the first true use of the phrase cruel and unusual punishment came in the 1689 English Bill of Rights. This was in response to James II using punishments for those who rebelled against him, including drawing and quartering, and being sent to the West Indies as indentured servants, and some others that I'd rather not think about. The Glorious Revolution, as it's known, led to the adoption of the Bill of Rights that included protections against cruel and unusual punishment by the new rulers, William III and Mary II. The next country to adopt this phrase was the United States, when they adopted it as part of their Bill of Rights as the Eighth Amendment to their Constitution. Now, this no doubt stemmed from the influence of the English Bill of Rights. There were also many Enlightenment thinkers who were actively writing on the topic of cruel and unusual punishment, although usually without phrase directly. That would include the very influential book On Crimes and Punishments by Cesare Beccaria, but also Locke, Voltaire, and Montesquieu who were writing about the topic as well. Further, the experience of receiving some harsh and, at times, arbitrary punishments from the British also influenced the US to adopt this as part of their constitution. From there, the Marquis de Lafayette took much of what he learned in America back to Europe. Eventually, he wrote the Declaration on the Rights of Man and the Citizen. While this didn't include the phrase cruel and unusual punishment, it did prohibit punishments from being more strict than necessary, which I would argue goes even beyond the prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Because the Declaration on the Rights of the Man and the Citizen is part of the preamble of the French Constitution, it has limits on how strict punishments can be. All three of these important early sources ultimately led to the adoption of prohibitions against cruel punishment in Article 5 of the Universal Declaration on Human Rights that was adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1948. As such, many more countries with ties to the United Kingdom, France, and the United States began adopting restrictions against cruel and unusual punishment in their constitutions written after 1948, although sometimes with slightly different wording. However, despite the general agreement around the world on prohibitions against cruel and unusual punishment, how that looks in different countries is going to be very different depending on that country's individual history. For example, in the United Kingdom, given the history of particularly degrading treatments, the emphasis in their jurisprudence is on prohibiting degrading punishments, while in France, the focus is often on proportionality, so the punishment is proportional to the crime, so that not everybody gets their head chopped off just for living in Paris. And in Germany, the emphasis is on preventing inhumane treatment, and let's just say that's because the inclusion of prohibitions against cruel punishment was brought in after World War II. And not all countries will agree on what the definition of cruel and unusual punishment is. Some ongoing discussions around the world include solitary confinement, the death penalty, and even certain methods of execution. Ultimately, it's up to the various governments, and especially the various judicial systems, to interpret what is a cruel and/or unusual punishment. Finally, before ending off, I want to talk about some reasons why governments may institute harsh penalties that may ultimately be deemed cruel by the courts, beyond them just being mean. The first is to act as a deterrent. Increasing the severity of a punishment does have some limited effect in deterring individuals from committing those crimes. However, there does seem to be a diminishing returns aspect to this, where increasing a penalty from life imprisonment to the death penalty seems to have very limited effect, whereas moving from, say, a fine to jail time is going to have more of an effect in deterring people's behavior. However, it should be noted as well that the likelihood of being caught seems to have a much greater effect than the severity of the punishment. Another aspect to consider is recidivism. That is, are people who receive severe punishments less likely to recommit the same crime? With the exception of punishments that end in death or life imprisonment, the evidence suggests this is not true. In fact, people who receive severe punishments such as long jail terms may be more likely to recommit crimes because of difficulties reintegrating into society at the end of their sentence. However, they won't be committing the crime for the duration of the sentence. And this is especially true for permanent sentences. That is, sentences that end in death or in life imprisonment. So in those cases, it can be seen as good for public safety. But while these may be some reasons for harsh penalties, ultimately, if it crosses that line into being cruel, it will be deemed unconstitutional or unlawful and therefore be unenforceable. But that's it from me today. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one.